Hello, Internet friend. I'm David Ravel, and this is ValueSide. For all of our articles and podcasts, visit valueside.com. Well, today, we ask the question, what's inflation? And it's the Fed's answer that makes all the difference. Well, if you were to ask anyone what is inflation, it's likely that you might get a couple of different answers. On the one hand, you might say, well, it's when prices rise. Or on the other hand, you may respond, it's when things cost more. Now, both answers are correct, but there's a mile's worth of difference between the two, and that difference is going to have a profound effect on our economic future. Our government, which assembles most of our economic data, has yet to decide which definition to use exclusively, so they use both. One agency, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, uses cost as its definition of inflation, while the other agency, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, uses another definition of inflation, price. What makes this difference so impactful is that different policymakers use different measures of inflation and arrive at markedly distinct recommendations as a result. So let's look at these two measures of inflation, cost and price. Now, the Bureau of Economic Analysis measures cost with something they call the Personal Consumption Expenditure, the PCE. It's a measure of how much you spend each month on the most common items that you purchase. During times of inflation, like we're having right now, your expenditures rise with the higher cost of goods and services. In other words, this is a measure of everyday items that you need, like food, energy, and shelter, plus anything else that you use regularly. If, say, next month you spend 1% more at the supermarket, then that's your PCE inflation for food for next month. Now, because we like to express inflation in annual terms, we need to multiply that number by 12 months to come up with a yearly PCE food inflation, and in this case it would be 12%. 1% times 12. Now here's the rub. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, merchants of all kinds have been having nothing but trouble. You're no doubt aware of all of these. It's clear to see it in the data. Sales have been all over the place. First came the problem of no customers. In April, November of 2020, as well as February of 2021, PCE costs, quote unquote, fell because merchants reduced prices to make sales. In each of those months, PCE inflation, therefore, fell. But they fell not because inflation went away, but because the customers did. Quarantines, whether imposed by various governments or self-imposed, caused customers to stay away from the stores in droves. Consequently, merchants lowered their prices just to move inventory. They often sold goods below cost before perishables spoiled or just to clear shelf space. Any policymaker that looked at the data in those 3 months and concluded that inflation was over was sadly mistaken, as it came roaring back in the following months. Using personal consumption as our chief measure of inflation has added a new dimension, the behavior of the merchants and their customers, as we've seen over the last couple of years. So let's look at price. Now, the original measure of inflation is a measure of price. Beginning the year of the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, the Minneapolis branch of the Federal Reserve, along with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, began calculating the changing price of a basket of goods. As the price of those goods rose, which was a measure of inflation for the average American, they created the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. It's a highly straightforward inflationary calculation, and still today, it's the most popular. Originally designed as a way for wages and salaries to keep up with rising prices, today it's used in contract negotiations and benefit packages as a way for people to keep up with the cost of living. Inflation, if you will. Ask the average American what's the best measure of inflation, and inevitably, they'll refer to the CPI. It's that popular everywhere except Washington, D.C. That's right. Our leaders don't use CPI inflation to measure the rise in prices. They use PCE, personal consumption expenditure, to measure inflation. Now, does this PCE group include the Federal Reserve, which is responsible for guiding our economy? The answer is absolutely yes. The Federal Reserve uses PCE inflation as its only measure of inflation. So yesterday, the Fed closed out its periodic meeting of its interest rate committee, the FOMC. The committee elected to hold its short-term interest rates, the Fed funds rate, steady at 5.5%. They then issued a brief statement. It was just 4 paragraphs long, and here's how they ended each and every section. Section 1, inflation remains elevated. Section 2, the committee remains highly attentive to inflation risks. Section 3, the committee is strongly committed to returning inflation to its 2% objective. And Section 4, the committee's assessment will take into account a wide range of information, including readings on labor market conditions, inflation pressures, and inflation expectations, as well as financial and international developments. Get it? Inflation is the number one driver of the central bank's monetary policy. I don't recall any other Fed that has been so focused on just one measure for this economy. This group has one drum, and they'll beat it as long as it takes to break inflation. But the question is, which inflation are we talking about? Is it PCE cost-based inflation or CPI price-based inflation? And the answer, as we said, is that the Federal Reserve uses cost-based PCE inflation, which is always nearly the higher of the two. For instance, in January of this year, cost-based PCE inflation ran at more than 18% in an annualized inflation rate, which would be very concerning to the Federal Reserve. On the other hand, price-based CPI inflation showed that inflation was only slightly more than 6%, or about a third as high as the Fed's favorite measure. Now, in the most recent measure of inflation for September, PCE inflation was recorded at 8.9% annualized, while CPI was half that rate at only 4.75%. See the big difference? Now, when the Fed selects PCE inflation, they use a measure of inflation in its most virulent light, making it appear that we have an inflation issue that's double the other measure of inflation, CPI. It means that they will persist in a tight monetary policy that lasts longer and does much more damage than needed to be done under a CPI definition of inflation. We can count then on higher interest rates and more quantitative tightening that will last far longer than would otherwise be needed. It will cause far more damage in terms of reduced economic output than would otherwise be required. What's inflation? The Fed's answer to that question makes all the difference. And in this case, it has chosen to fight inflation that is bound to make our lives much more difficult. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel. ValueSide is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.